Okay, everyone. Well, it's 7:15.
All right.
Welcome to all my old friends from 401. I know we've rolled right into 402, and it's a little overwhelming for some. But this week's a little low key. I don't think you have a spreadsheet due. Don't you feel happy about that?
I'm not getting any homework assignments. I know that much.
Yeah, woohoo, this deck. And some people are new. They actually are doing 402 first and then going backwards into 401.
Weird.
Yeah, well, that's what they chose that route.
Yeah.
We had someone start, and Marcus also teaches the finance and accounting class, which is in May.
June, May.
Something like that. I think it's May. So we had somebody who found themselves there as their first class, and then they had to work their way backwards through the other classes. I'm like, how did that go? You started with finance. Oh, Diana's going backwards too. Okay, well, we accommodate you. We do the best we can. So most of you have met Marcus in 401. He does our intro talk there. So since we cover a lot of different topics in this class, particularly related to the site or the facility, and issues around that, issues around hiring. I think we covered that here. So we cover different topics that he doesn't have to talk about trademarking now.
Right.
Which consumes about an hour of the...
Could be more like 4 hours.
401, yeah. So there's other legal issues that are more relevant to this class. This class has got a lot about capital investments and other more advanced topics than what we've covered in 401. So we love having him come and open this class, get you started thinking about your lawyer.
I love being here.
So we'll let Marcus take it away.
Great.
I'll let you have the mouse back.
So as Mellie said, this section is more about drilling down into some of the issues that I might have touched on in the first session, but really it's not that, if you're going backwards, it's not that big of a deal. A lot of these are new issues, and I think you can get some value out of both. And the value I'm hoping that you get out of this session, like the last, is just kind of a general overview of issues you should be looking at. This session isn't intended to allow you to just take this information and just go out and do all these things. You know, negotiate your own lease, negotiate your own distribution agreement. I still feel very strongly that it's a good idea to engage a lawyer with some relevant expertise to help you on things like that. But this is so that you can ask the right questions, and as you're putting your business plan together and putting it into action, have these concepts in mind so that so you don't miss anything. So let's go ahead and get started on a few things here. First of all, lawyers love disclaimers. The legal information contained within this presentation is intended to inform you about legal matters of current interest. It's not intended as legal advice. We recommend that you not act upon the information contained in this presentation without seeking professional counsel. So that's my lawyerly way of saying, I'm going to give you what sounds like legal advice, but it's not really legal advice. It's just information. So the first topic we're going to talk about today is leasing a brewery space. And not everybody's going to be in this position. Some folks are fortunate enough to have the capital behind them that they can go out and buy the space of their dreams, or maybe you're opening up in your garage or something like that. But I'd say for the vast majority of breweries starting out or distilleries starting out, you're going to be leasing a commercial space. So these are some of the aspects of that you're going to be thinking about and dealing with as you negotiate your maybe the lease you've ever entered into. First of all, just the general importance of this document and of this negotiation. You're often going to be entering into a relationship with a landlord that's going to last probably at least 5 years, often more than that, into 10 years, and with renewal terms often 15 or 20 years. So needless to say, this is a very important negotiation. It's a very important document. All too often I see people negotiating their own leases or just signing on the dotted line without really putting much thought into that. I consider that to be a huge mistake, and I'll give some reasons why that is, some examples of things that I've seen that have gotten people in trouble. So legal and practical issues to consider when selecting a space. And we're going to start with one I can give you an example on, which is zoning and use restrictions. I've seen this several times now. I'm dealing with this currently with a client, where you find this beautiful space you want to get into, and maybe it's a warehouse, and it had an auto shop in it before, and you walk in and your eyes fill with sparkles, and you look at this space and think, man, I could fit a lot of fermenters in here. And you get a hold of the lease from the landlord, you take a look at it, everything looks good, you sign the lease, and then you call in your architect, and your architect comes in and starts looking the space over and says, okay, so what's this space zoned again? And you kind of shrug your shoulders and say, who cares, let's just build a brewery. The problem is, if it's not zoned appropriately, you're not going to be building a brewery, or maybe you're building a brewery but not a tasting room. I'm dealing with an issue right now where this happened, and the individual's in a 5-year, maybe even a 10-year lease, no apparent way out of it, and it cannot be used as for the intended purpose. That's a really bad situation. So this is part of the due diligence process. When you are looking at a space, get an architect in there, get somebody with some industry expertise in there, check with the city to see what is zoned and what's going to need to be done in order to get your intended use into that space. And also along with that, if there is a change of use or change of zoning, how much is that going to cost and how long is it going to take? Because sometimes the numbers behind that can be astronomical. I've heard of folks going in and having to convert to retail use for their brew pub, and it costs them $100,000 just in sidewalk improvements to bring that property up to the standard that the city wants it to be at. So very important, do your due diligence, look into these things. And as a very, you can hire people to do these on a very, very detailed level, but on a very high level, you can also just go to the city or go to the county and ask for the documents on showing what the zoning is on that, and talk to the city or county about what you can use that property for. And they'll be very forthcoming about that, because that's what their job is. Availability of expansion space, another big issue that can bite people is when they get into a small space and they have these neighbors around them and think, well, eventually I'll just take over this whole building as I expand. That all sounds really good if you have the ability to do that. Make sure you write into your lease that you get a right of first refusal on those neighboring properties if they become available. And you can even ask your landlord or potential landlord, what the prospect of that is. Is this a tenant that's going to be there, the neighboring tenant? Are they going to be there for 20 years? They're going to be there for 5 years? Maybe they're a struggling business and they're going to want out sooner than their lease even allows, and you can do them a favor by taking that space off their hands. But plan in advance for that. Accessible loading dock is one of those issues that it's not really a legal issue, it's a practical issue, but make sure that you're going to be able to have your distributor or your own truck back into that loading dock and have access to it. I've seen situations where you have a loading dock, everything looks great, but you also have neighbors around you who park their cars there, and you have it written into your lease that you have access to that loading dock during particular hours. That can become pretty complicated in some situations. I've also seen loading docks where it's a loading dock, but there's no way for that vehicle to maneuver into that loading dock. So make sure that that's in place. Structural components. This another great example on this one. An individual was getting into a brewery, leased the space, signed everything was fully executed, and brought his engineer in to look at the load bearing capacity of the floors, and they were not, the capacity was not high enough to hold a fermenter. Fermenters are extremely heavy pieces of equipment. They hold a lot of liquid. That's what they do. So make sure that that floor is going to hold up, and the folks who can help you there are architects and engineers who have some expertise in determining what the load's going to be. You can also sometimes in a lease get a landlord to represent that the floor has a certain load bearing capacity. You can make sure that goes into the lease if they do represent that, so that if it doesn't have that capacity, if that floor fails, that's going to be on your landlord. You can at least, as a minimum, get out of your lease if that happens. And just as a general concept, when I talk about landlord representation, make sure that if your landlord is representing something to you before you enter into the lease, such as structural components of the building, such as what the zoning is, such as availability of parking, things like that, make sure that those elements get put into the lease. There's a clause in almost every lease that's called an integration clause. And basically what that says is everything that has been represented has been put into this agreement. And if it's not in this agreement, then that representation is not binding on anyone, and it basically just disappears into the void. So make sure those representations are in your lease. Retail elements are another big component, because a lot of business plans call for a tap room or some kind of pub element to your business. Make sure that the facility is zoned to allow for something like that. A lot of folks get into trouble where they see that they can put their brewery in a space, but then when they go to put their tap room in, they figure out that, well, as an accessory use to this industrial or manufacturing use, you can only put so large of a retail space in. And sometimes it's a very small retail space and much smaller than you had planned. So make sure that you can actually have that tap room that you're banking on. Parking and traffic. This is a pretty obvious one. If you are intending to have any kind of reserved parking in the building, or parking that's just for your business, make sure that's put into the lease. And also just traffic in general, make sure that you are, it's what you expect. Sometimes I had one client once who just staked out his building for a long time. He spent several days just hanging out, watching the traffic go by to see if it was getting enough traffic and the kind of traffic he was looking for as far as the kind of customers he wanted to be driving past his establishment. Another thing to consider there is that in some jurisdictions, if your business is going to increase traffic, if you're going to have people coming to your business, some cities are going to hit you up for that. They'll basically charge you a fee for the increased traffic that's going to be coming to the area. It's an interesting concept, but that's how cities afford to repair their streets. Outdoor seating, that's another one that a lot of folks, when they're getting into a lease, they just assume that, okay, the building is here, there's this big wide sidewalk out here, I'm going to be able to put some bistro tables out there for my tap room. That may be the case, or you may have a landlord that says, no, I'm really not interested in having this outdoor seating arrangement, so if it's not your lease, you're not going to be able to do it. And also in a lot of jurisdictions, you have to get a permit from the city to be able to have any kind of occupancy on that sidewalk. You're also going to want that outdoor seating area to be included in your floor plan for your establishment when you send that floor plan to your state regulatory agency to get your licensing. And the TTB is going to want to know about that as well. Noise and odor limitations are something that seems to more and more often be an issue as breweries and distilleries are popping up in urban areas that are surrounded by apartment complexes and condos and things like that and other businesses. Not everyone thinks that breweries smell wonderfully, and I happen to think they smell really, really good, but not everyone does. So I've heard of people getting complaints about odor, and I've even very recently heard of a big issue between a landlord and tenant over this noise and odor limitation, because there was a limitation in the lease. The landlord said it was too much odor, and they had gotten some neighbor complaints, and basically the demand was that you stop making beer, which is not a very reasonable demand. And noise, if you're going to have entertainment, live music, anything like that, make sure that you are allowing for that in your lease. Neighborhood acceptance is something that is often underestimated, but very important. I was just chatting today with somebody from our local ABC, our Oregon Liquor Control Commission, who every time I talk to him, he says, when you're preparing to get your license, go to the neighborhood association. Make sure they're going to accept your premises. Don't just assume that you can put something in and people are going to love it. Not everybody loves brew pubs. Not everybody loves breweries. I've heard particular instances where maybe there's a religious establishment nearby and they object to having somebody producing alcohol on their block. Things like that can be a big problem when you go to get your licensing. So check into that before you sign that lease, and definitely before you go to get your license. Yeah, I agree, Eric. What is this world coming to?
Great comments, you guys.
Johnson says, neighborhood acceptance is a big issue in Eugene right now on account of Ninkasi's success in our own brewery district. I'm sure it is. Ninkasi has taken over down there a large section of the city, and people who live around there, not everybody's probably a big fan of that. You have Hop Valley down there and Oakshire, and it's booming, and yeah, I'm sure there are some pretty upset citizens, and people in Eugene might have a reputation as well for being sensitive. I've lived there for a while. Basic negotiable lease terms. We talked about some of those already, but some other big ones, tenant improvements. A lot of landlords will basically give you a fund to improve the premises for your use, or will even do some of the improvements for you, such as a good example might be they'll upgrade the restrooms in the premises to make them ADA compliant, or they'll splash of paint on the walls, or sometimes they'll build walls into the place to make it ready for you. There are a couple of reasons that landlords do this. They're not really doing it out of the just generosity of their heart. It's because, for one thing, it improves their premises. It makes it more occupiable, but not just by you, but by any future tenants. It improves the value of their property. The other thing is they're most likely taking that amount that they're putting into that and just building it into your lease amount. So you might feel like you're getting something for free, but you're probably paying for it over the next 5 or 10 years. It's still actually a pretty good deal for you, because it's better to do that than have to take out a loan, pay interest on that loan, and start paying a bank for that right away. I should say it's often better. So it's something to consider and something to negotiate up front. Rent and rent abatements. A lot of reasonable landlords will give you a few months rent to allow you to get your business started before you have your cash flow running. That they understand that you don't have money to pay rent because you're not making and selling beer yet. Again, this sounds like one of those things where it's like first month's rent is free, yay, but it's actually probably in a lot of cases built into your rent as well. Sometimes you'll be given a rental amount for the full term, and you can negotiate that, okay, we're going to keep it at this rental rate, but we're going to have 3 or 4 months of rent abatement, and yeah, maybe you are actually getting 3 free months of rent, and it's worth it to that landlord to actually get somebody into that space, especially for a space that maybe is difficult to rent. You can really leverage a landlord into some good rent abatements. Term and renewal options. I talk to a lot of people who like to say, I want to get into this property for as long as I can. Get me into a 15-year lease. Get me into a 10-year lease. That sounds great because it locks up the property for a long time, but it also locks you up for a long time. And maybe you want to move to another location. Maybe you expand. Maybe things aren't working out and you need to shut the business down. For whatever reason, it's not a bad idea to keep that rent term at some kind of minimal amount, such as maybe a 5-year term, and then plug in renewal terms. That's a good benefit for you, because you can get into that 20-year long lease where you have access to that space for 20 years, but you're not tied up for the full 20 years. You can do it 5 years at a time. All you have to do is let your landlord know about 180 days in advance or so that you're going to be renewing the lease. Often your rent is going to be adjusted at the time of renewal, but you can negotiate the amount the rent is going to be adjusted in advance, which also gives you the expectation of what you're going to be paying for that 20 years. Utilities, just negotiate who is going to be paying for what. I've heard of some breweries where the landlord pays for all the water in the facility, and I just love that. And
they didn't know what they were getting into.
They had no idea what they were getting into, and it's a huge perk for the brewery. because as you know, you use a little bit of water in the process. So negotiate that in advance so you know what you're going to be paying for. Brewery utilities can be pretty pricey, so you don't want it to be, if you're expecting the landlord to pay for something and you end up paying for it, it just might not be in your budget. Indemnification is one of these legal terms that I would say it's one of the most negotiated terms of contracts in general. What indemnification means is if you screw up and your landlord gets sued as a result of you screwing up, you have to pay your landlord's defense. You have to pay for any damages that your landlord has to pay as a result of your negligence, and you have to hold your landlord harmless from any kind of fault or damages or anything like that. So it's basically a big fat release for your landlord saying, hey, if you screw up, I don't want any part of this. The problem is sometimes these indemnification provisions are drawn so broadly that even if the landlord screws up and gets sued while you are in this space, you're going to end up paying for that defense, paying for those damages and so forth. Make sure that it makes sense that you're going to cover the landlord for something that you screw up, but make sure that you're not covering them for something that they screw up. And you can also write in provisions that allow for insurance to pay for some of these things. So if the landlord's insurance is going to cover it, there's no reason for you to pay it. So that's another part that can be accepted out of an indemnification provision. Assignment is another one of these often overlooked provisions, can be incredibly important. Assignment means you get to a point in the lease where maybe you need to move out for those reasons we just talked about, and you have somebody else who wants to come in and take over the space. The assignment provision is going to tell you whether you can do that with or without the landlord's consent, and often the landlord will require that they be able to consent to that assignment, and if so, you can specify in there the conditions of that consent. So in other words, maybe you find another brewery that comes along and says, hey, we'd love to take over your space if you're moving along. This sounds great, but if you have a provision in there that says the landlord can deny consent for any reason, the landlord can deny consent for any reason. They can simply say, we don't want another brewery in there. You guys are doing great. We want to keep you in there. More often you'll get these provisions that say the landlord has to consent to the assignment but will not unreasonably deny that consent. That way they at least have to act with good faith in deciding whether they consent to it. And in most cases, if it's a reasonable business decision, they will. Next is the personal guarantee. Every now and then I'll see a lease with a landlord who doesn't require a personal guarantee, and I'm always shocked when it happens. It just doesn't happen that much these days. You're almost certainly going to have to personally guarantee your lease. Or if you have a business, maybe that business is going to guarantee that lease. Or if you don't have a penny to your name, maybe your rich uncle is going to have to personally guarantee that lease. The landlord is going to want somebody on the hook other than your startup business that has no financial history, no assets available to pay in case of a default, all these risks involved with starting up the business. Your landlord's not going to want to assume those risks, so they're going to cover themselves just like a bank will, and a lot of third parties will, by getting one of these personal guarantees. If you can negotiate out of them, that's great. And another thing we try to do sometimes is negotiate to where that personal guarantee will sunset. In other words, maybe in 5 years, you have this operating history, and you have this company that's worth a lot of money and has all this brewing equipment and all this good stuff. Maybe your landlord at that point will agree to release you a personal guarantee. And anytime you can make that happen, it's great. And by the way, feel free to pop in with any questions. What is this world coming to is a great question, but I didn't spend much time on it. So feel free to hop in and ask about any of this stuff. That's a lot of information, so you can also tell me to slow down if that's necessary. Termination contingencies. These are sort of a unique part of beverage company leases, because a beverage company has to, once you get into the lease, that's just the beginning of becoming qualified to do business under that lease. TTB isn't even going to want to see your permit application, your brewer's notice application, until you have that lease. They want you to upload the copy of that lease with your TTB application. In other words, you're going to sign into that lease and then find out if you can actually produce the product that you want to produce. So what we usually do is build in a contingency that says, if for some reason I'm unable to get my TTB brewer notice or my basic permit for a distiller, or if maybe you're unable to get your license locally, or maybe you're unable to get the zoning variance that you need to get, all these factors that need to fall into place for you to start up your business. If one of those doesn't happen, you can escape from your lease. You can terminate the lease. Of course, landlords aren't a huge fan of that. You're entering into an agreement with them. They want to stick you into that agreement for the full term. So what usually ends up happening is you negotiate some kind of out clause that says, if one of these contingencies happen, I can get out of my lease, but maybe I forfeit a couple months rent, or maybe I forfeit my security deposit. A lot of times they'll even make you pay a higher amount of security deposit in order to get into one of these contingencies. I've never had anybody have to use one because people tend to get the licensing they need. They've done their due diligence in advance to know that they're going to get it. But if that did happen, if that worst case scenario did happen, this is your way out. And if you have to give up $10,000 to get out of your lease and just lose that money, that's still better than being in a 10-year lease with no escape. So build these contingencies in. Another big contingency can be financing. Sometimes you can't have your bank financing or your private investment in place until you have your lease secured. So build that into where if you don't get the financing you need, you can get out. It's like a house. You know, if you're buying a house, you put in all these contingencies. What if we inspect it and we find something wrong? What if we can't get our bank loan? It's the same kind of thing. Make sure you have your safety net. Use of the premises. That's simply to say that in every lease, there's a description of what your business is, how you're going to use the premises. Make sure that that covers all of your uses. Making beer might describe a lot of what you do, but maybe it's not all you do, because you're packaging beer, you're selling beer at retail, you're maybe selling food, you're maybe selling merchandise, maybe you're going to have live music. Just build all that stuff in. There's no limit on how you can describe the use that you're going to be doing. So make sure the landlord is well aware of that use and it's in the lease. That way the landlord can't come back and say, well, you said you were going to be making beer, you didn't say you were going to be making pizza. I wasn't in this for a restaurant deal, I was in this for a brewery. That'll prevent that from causing problems. Business hours, this can cut both ways. Sometimes it's, sometimes people don't like to limit themselves by putting their business hours in. Sometimes landlords require that you put your business hours in the lease. The TTB is going to want to know your business hours. So figure that out, put it in there, and make sure it's wide enough to cover all you're going to be doing. And sometimes maybe you're going to be doing an all-night brew session. Make sure you account for that, something like that too. So when it says business hours, maybe you want to specify that we're going to be open for retail from noon till 2 a.m., but sometimes we're going to be in the manufacturing process throughout the night. It also helps if the landlord for some reason tells you that you can't do something because it's outside of your business hours. You can point to that and say, hey, you said I can operate during these times, so you can't stop me from operating. Outdoor space, we already talked about that a bit. Make sure that's in the lease. Environmental covenants. This is one of those issues it's not huge for breweries, but it certainly could be. You want to make sure that you're not going to be held liable for any kind of environmental contaminants that were on the property before you arrived at it. Sometimes, often when you're entering into a lease, you're probably not going to get any kind of environmental investigation done. Maybe you will because maybe there's concern around that. But you want to make sure that any contaminants that happen to be there, you're not going to be held responsible for them. On the same token, landlord's going to expect that if you do contaminate the property, you're going to be on the hook for that, even if it's years after you've left the premises. Sorry, I'm starting to lose my voice a little bit. I'm catching one of those colds. Alterations. In most situations, when you get into your facility, you're going to be making some massive alterations. And you're going to have designs either on paper or in mind that you want to go forward with. Make sure your landlord is on board with those alterations. Most leases are going to have a provision that says landlord has to consent to any alteration to the premises. That gives them a lot of discretion. And again, you can have one of those reasonable consent deals in there, but in the end, the landlord's going to have a lot of discretion over these things. So the best thing you can do for that is take that design that you've come up with, give it to the landlord before you enter into the lease. Get their consent before you enter into the lease, because that's when you have the most leverage with your landlord. You can say, this is our plan, and we need this. We need you to sign off on this so that we can go forward with our business plan. You can even make it an exhibit to the list showing what work is going to be done. And even on that, show who's going to do what work. You're going to perform these alterations, landlord's going to prepare these alterations. Make sure if the landlord's doing some alterations that there's a time frame set up for those. So the landlord doesn't take a year to get them done. Maybe you set up a couple of months by which time they're going to be finished with their alterations. Maybe the lease doesn't actually even commence until the landlord has finished doing their part of the work on the property. A lot of options there, and one suggestion for provisions like that are kind of more practical business type provisions. Work with a broker. In most jurisdictions, either by law or by industry standard, your real estate broker is going to be paid by the landlord in the deal. Again, that payment might be built into your lease, but the broker gets paid by the landlord, and brokers can provide a tremendous service in this process by telling you, what's a reasonable rent to be paying, what's reasonable for, what's a reasonable approach to having the landlord agree to these alterations. They can kind of guide you through that process, and I should say a good broker will do that. Not all of them are good, but there are some that are very hands-on, will help you through that process. And there are some, at least in our town, who are very industry-oriented. They know the brewing industry well, and they know what breweries are looking for. Of course, I live in Portland, Oregon, so there's a specialist for everything brewery-related in this town. But yeah, that's my pitch for brokers. They can also help you find a space, which is a very valuable service. And insurance, this is another one of these kind of particular areas where it's good to have somebody who has some industry expertise. The lease agreement is almost always going to specify what level of insurance coverage you have to have. And a lot of times in a letter of intent, which is the document you enter into before the lease, kind of just laying out the basic business terms, the parties haven't negotiated those levels of insurance. So I've had this happen several times recently where the brewery enters into the letter of intent. It has all the big things like how much is rent's going to be, what's the square footage, all these business terms. Then you go to negotiate the lease, and the one provision that we can't get done is the insurance provision, because you inevitably get these landlords who have an idea that breweries are these super high liability businesses, and they want to just make you have all the insurance in the world. And insurance costs a lot of money. So we've been getting, small breweries going into small spaces, and they're asking them to get $5 million in liability coverage, which is totally unreasonable. In our area, a $1 million individual and $2 million aggregate liability insurance policy with maybe a $1 million in liquor liability policy is pretty much the standard. It's not the same in every area, so make sure to check with your local agent on that. But I've had several landlords recently who really try to stick people with these huge limits, and it's going to cost them thousands of dollars a year. We're usually able to get them off of that, but sometimes it's a negotiation that ends up somewhere in the middle, so you're still paying more than you want to for insurance. Negotiate that in advance in your letter of intent before you even get to the lease stage. All right, let's finally get into the licensing. Eric, so leasing a spot in a light industrial area that's been on the market a while with no residential concerns, it's a good option to pursue. Sure, if the zoning permits your use. A lot of, this totally depends on state and local law, but a lot of light industrial areas are going to have these big, warehouse type facilities that are great for breweries. The problem is some of the zoning in those areas is going to have, at least what locally is essentially a retail showroom exemption, which might give you on a 10,000 square foot building, maybe gives you, 1,000 square feet or 500 square feet of retail space. So if you're planning on doing a brew pub, that's probably not going to cut it. If maybe you want 5,000 square feet of production space, 5,000 of retail space, something like that, just make sure you check with the zoning on that to see if your retail use is going to fit in with it. But yeah, for just production, that can be a great fit.
No tasting room?
Yeah, what I mean by retail is tasting room as well. Yeah. There's kind of this assumption out there that you can open a brewery and set a tasting room right in the middle of it and everything's hunky-dory, but that tasting room is often going to be considered a retail use, and you have to have that. Within your zoning allowance. You're making me thirsty talking about Ballard Fill.
Did an ecliptic beer downstairs.
Okay, let's get into licensing. I'm not going to go into this in any great detail because we go into it in much more detail, at least on the TTB side, in the 404 class. But it's good to have this in your mind, especially some of the timing issues with it. So federal licensing is governed by the Federal Alcohol Administration Act and the Internal Revenue Code, which is basically the authority that the TTB acts under, because TTB is essentially a tax collecting agency. And by TTB, I mean the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau. It's the U.S., it used to be called the ATF. It's the U.S. Agency that basically deals with breweries, distilleries, and wineries. The ttb.gov website and permits online system is a really wonderful resource for learning about what the TTB does and what their requirements are. I suggest very early on in the process going to that website, combing through it, check out the application process. They even have a great kind of walkthrough tutorial deal now that shows you how to fill out your brewer's permit application.
It's very confusing for cider makers, though.
Yeah, it really is.
It's crazy.
It makes no sense for cider.
It makes no sense. The words don't make sense.
Yeah.
You have to actually, I just went to like a 2-hour training thing on how to fill it out for cider.
Yeah,
it's so confusing.
It's totally crazy, and I asked, and
Mead's going to fall under
same thing.
Same thing.
Yeah.
It won't make any sense because it'll say things like artificially carbonated. It's like, what does that mean?
And it's what was the one I got tripped up on? There's one part of the TTB application that says if you're making under if you're making under 7% alcohol, then you only need a blender's license. You don't need a producer's license. That's not true, and it's totally wrong. And when I told the investigator that was on the application, he said, "Oh, that's not right." So here's a tip for you cideries and meaderies. When you're filling that out, you are a producer blender because you're producing alcohol. You're manufacturing alcohol. Don't let that little I next to it that pops up and says you don't need to click on this. Ignore that. Click on producer blender. What happens if you don't is you have to start your application all over again after you've already been through the whole process. The first time this happened to us, we learned the hard way. The first time this happened to us, we had a great investigator who said, "Hey, just streamline this thing, get the new application right to me, we'll pick up where we left off. But I don't know that all investigators would do that. He hooked us up. So yeah, TTB Brewer's Permit, it's go online, fill out your owner officer information form. You can do that without having to submit an application. Just get that part done, and that's for anybody who has 10% or more ownership in the company, or any director with ownership or officer with ownership, or any officer period, actually. And then get your application started. I don't care if you're a month away from getting your lease completed. I don't care if you haven't even found your space yet. Go ahead and get the application started. You can go through the application, fill in a lot of the stuff, figure out the information you're going to need for it, and then go through later and fill in the rest. Until you hit the submit button at the very end, you haven't submitted anything, and it's just saved in the system. You can go back and work on it. So it takes a ridiculously long, ridiculous amount of time to fill this application out and to get all the information together. So get started early. To be licensed for microbrewery that you want to make one cider a year as a seasonal, would that be difficult to get licensed for?
You still need to get a separate license.
Yeah, you would need to get a winery, and for TTB purposes, you would need both a winery and a producer blender permit, and you'd need a brewer's notice. And under TTB, you can get both. Licenses. So yeah, it's a very similar licensing process for both things. But yeah, you need both of them. Under your state, we'll get into this a little bit more here in a second, but under your state system, you might be able to do both under one license, but that depends on the state. One of the hints I put on here for TTB brewer permit, or for your basic permit application, or for a producer blender application, be accurate and thorough, err on the side of too much information. Your investigator is never going to tell you, you just gave us too much, we want you to trim this down. The more detailed you are, the more information you give, the more likely you're going to get through this process smoothly and with not having to provide a whole lot more information. Because the way the process works is you submit your application, it goes into a triage process, which takes a few weeks. They assign in that process your application to an investigator. The investigator is the guy who goes through this very thoroughly, makes sure that all the pieces are in place, and asks you questions about your operations to make sure everything's there that they need. He's the guy who has the power to deny your application. Doesn't seem to happen that often, but it can. If you have people with the wrong kind of background trying to get into your company, that's one reason people get denied.
All your gangster relatives?
Yeah, keep your gangster relatives out of the brewing industry. After your investigator is done, investigator forwards it to what they call the chief, and I think there are only 3 chiefs at the OLCC, or at the TTB. These are the folks that have the final say to sign their name on it and give you your brewer's notice or your producer blender permit. That takes a couple of weeks. All in all, you're looking at least 90 days probably to get through the process. The TTB website has this cool thing that shows you what their average permit time is. I usually take that as a challenge, try to get it done sooner than that. I think they're listing it at about 120 days or so right now. And I've heard of some folks taking that long. I recently talked to somebody who applied in July and got their TTB permit last week, I believe, which is painful, but it does happen sometimes. My advice on something like that is call often, email often, find out the contact information for your investigator, keep on them in a very polite, kind way. These people hold your future in their hands, and they're busy people, so be nice about it, but squeaky wheel gets the grease with all these agencies. What about part owner's previous alcohol offenses at Dewey?
Thanks.
Will they still be able to get licensed? In most cases, yes. TTB is not going to care about something like a Dewey in most cases. TTB is more concerned about are you a terrorist or
organized crime?
Or are you an organized crime?
If you're in Chicago.
Right, right. They want to make sure you're not going to be trying to steal money from the government, basically. If you're convicted of like a fraud or forgery or something like that, yeah, maybe that's a problem. Your state agency may have more strict standards. I know our local OLCC, a single Dewey isn't going to have that much of an effect usually. Multiple Deweys might, or a drug conviction could, things like that. Call your local agency if that's a concern. Call your agency and ask them what their standard is for that. The answer you'll get is, I can't tell you anything for sure, but generally in this kind of situation, things work out right, or something like that. In general, do you feel like investigators read thoroughly enough to really know the business, no rubber stamping? That's a good question. I feel like TTB investigators have a checklist, and 404, we'll have to ask Janine about this, because Janine, one of our guests in 404, hopefully she'll do it again, was a TTB investigator. She can answer this question, but I get the impression that they have a checklist and they're going down through and making sure all of these criteria are met, and if they are, you get your rubber stamp. It doesn't feel like there's a lot of subjectivity going on, although where I've run into some subjectivity is in your floor plan. Maybe you come up against something where they say, I think there should be a wall here separating your tap room from your facility. Well, why do you think that? Well, it's just kind of our policy that we like that to be separated. Well, would a curtain work? No, I don't think a curtain would work. That kind of subjectivity can enter into it, but it's overall they have some pretty defined standards, I would say. Doug contract brew a seasonal meat at a meadery and then offer it on tap without an extra license. Contract brew at a meadery. I'm not sure I understand the question, Jason. I might need more clarification on that. So maybe going through somebody who has a winery license to make some mead if you're a brewer.
Well, he just wants to have a mead, but you could go to a meadery and have it contract brewed without having to have a license.
And then offer it on tap. You're going to need some kind of license to be able to sell it. You can contract for its production, but production is just one step. You then have to be able to sell it, and there are a couple ways you can do that. One is get your own winery license to be able to sell it. The other is to get a wholesaler's license that allows you to sell as well. Although a wholesale license is more for distribution than for offering it on tap. If you're operating on tap, you're probably going to need you're going to need a winery license, and a lot of that's governed by state law too. So just check with your state's law. Uncle named Capone, I would avoid that guy, although he can probably help you fund your business under the table. So state licensing, each state has its own regulatory scheme. They adhere to the three-tier system. I'm sure everybody's at least generally aware of what the three-tier system is. You have your, I probably went over that in 401, right? You've got your manufacturing side, your distributor side, your retail side. Just make sure you pay attention to things like that. For questions like you just asked, whether you can be both a producer and have your tap room, those are state law issues. Most states require a license to ship beer into the state. It's often called a certificate or a certificate of authority or something like that is what it's often called. And it just means you go through that. If you're importing beer to another state, you have to go through their alcohol beverage control board and get some kind of authorization to be able to do that. And a lot of states won't allow you to self-distribute in their state if you're from out of state, so you have to go through a distributor when you do that in most cases.
So there's still confusion over this. I think if you're a microbrewery and or say you're Hopworks, well now Hopworks is making their own cider, but if they can buy somebody else's cider and serve it. They don't need to have a cidery license for that.
Right.
A winery license is what
right.
the official category is.
That's going to be governed by state law, though. So your retail aspect is going to be governed by state law. So like under Oregon law, like I said, if you have a brew pub license, that allows you to serve your own beer, allows you to serve other people's beer, allows you to serve wine, does not allow you to serve spirits unless you have an additional full on-premise commercial license. And the same with a winery license. A winery license allows you to sell beer, allows you to sell cider, everything. So that part's governed by state law. CCB generally doesn't care about the retail aspect of your business. They, in fact, prefer that it be pretty much separated from your production facility. In fact, with distilleries, you have to have a wall between, you have to have a real wall between your tasting room and your manufacturing facility. And they want that to have a door that locks, and they want it to be very secure. Wineries, they like to have some kind of separation between the tap room and the production facility. Breweries, it seems to be more open. They don't seem to care as much about that. I mean, people have tasting rooms practically, between fermenters in their breweries, so they're a lot more loose on that. Some of the stuff has no rhyme or reason. It's old policy stuff that has just kind of lingered around. I don't get it, but that's the state of the law. And just a final note on that, state liquor licenses typically will not trump local or county laws and codes. So if you have a state liquor license, but you're in a dry county, that's going to be a problem for you. So look into that stuff too.
So we're going to run out of time, so I don't know if you're going to.
I'm just going to fly through distribution on this stuff because there's a whole section now on distribution. It's one of my favorite topics. It's one of the most interesting topics, I believe. But there's a whole section on it now that Jeff teaches, right? Mm-hmm. And I go, maybe I don't go over it 404, but let me buzz through some of this stuff. Distribution laws vary state to state. Some are control states. Very few are control states when it comes to beer these days. By control state, I mean that the state is basically the distributor of your product. Oregon, for instance, is a control state when it comes to liquor. Oregon, the state of Oregon, is the sole distributor of spirits within the state. Many states do have what are called franchise laws, though. This governs the relationship between distributor and brewer. These often don't apply to wineries, and because a lot of states are control states with liquor, they don't apply to liquor either. These are often malt beverage franchise laws, and what they basically say is you have to choose one distributor that's going to be your exclusive distributor within a particular area of the state, usually delineated by county, and if you're going to get out of that relationship with that distributor, you have to do certain things, such as pay them a whole heck of a lot of money. But the franchise laws vary tremendously state to state. There are kind of some themes that go on among the states. So for instance, one of the themes is if you're going to get out of your distribution contract, you have to pay your distributor fair market value for the distribution rights. What I'll say about that is try to negotiate fair market value in advance if you can. A lot of states are allowing these fair market value buyouts. Not all of them. Some of them you still can't buy your way out of a distribution contract. You're in it for life unless the distributor breaches their agreement with you. Or there are a few other factors, but for the most part, you're in it for life. And the states that have changed to a system where you can buy your way out, they usually don't define what that price is. So try to define it by contract. There are varying schools of thought on this as to whether it's legal to define it by contract. I believe it is. Try to negotiate it in. Your distributor might tell you it's not legal to define it by contract. I would call their bluff on that. It's very important. I'm friends with a general counsel for a top 50 brewery. She's an in-house counsel at the brewery, and she said they will not enter into a distribution contract unless it has a reasonable compensation provision in it that tells them how much they're going to pay to get out of their distribution agreement. And by reasonable compensation, it's usually something that says like the brewery will pay the distributor some multiple of the distributor's gross profits over the past 12 months. So take how much money that distributor made off of your product for the past 12 months, multiply that by something, somewhere between like 2 and 9 times that. The industry standard seems to be somewhere around 3 to 4 from what I've been seeing. That's a lot of money. So keep that in mind when you're entering into a distribution agreement. It costs a lot of money to get out of them. The reality of the situation is you're usually not going to be the one to pay that money. Your next distributor usually is, because they're the ones buying out your contract. But it's for that reason also, it's good to have that amount defined so that your next distributor knows what they're going to have to pay. Because if they get into a situation where your current distributor is saying, I think the value of this brand is 9 times gross profit, the new distributor might say, that's not worth it to me, and I'm not going to fight this, so I'm just going to walk away, and you're stuck with that same old distributor. It's a big, nasty issue. It's a very, if any of you come out to Craft Brewers Conference this year in Portland, I expect this to be another hot topic. It was hot last time. I think it's going to be even hotter this time. It's becoming a very divisive issue in the brewing industry. Keep up with it. It's fascinating stuff. And look into your state's distribution laws, your franchise laws.
Yeah, Florida's where all the action is right now.
Yes, yes.
So everybody's following the Florida fights that got a lot of powerful money on both sides.
Yeah, and that's what it's going to take to get some change. It's going to take some of the bigger breweries stepping up and fighting these things. Some of them are rather draconian. Really, people are really getting screwed over by them, but they're gradually changing, it seems. The Brewers Association has taken a position that state franchise laws should allow an exemption for small breweries from franchise law, and that's the way some states are going, such as Washington, up north from here. If you're under 200,000 barrels, I think it is, you're not even subject to the state's franchise law. You still see a lot of contracts that are very franchise law-like. The distributor will basically put you in a contract that looks like franchise law, but at least you don't have to sign that contract. You can actually negotiate those terms, which is, I think, a very good thing. Elements of the distribution agreement, the territory, the brands that are going to be distributed, the use of your intellectual property, pricing and payment terms. Everything's negotiable unless it's in franchise law, and use your leverage. Try to negotiate some of this stuff. If you're nervous getting into the relationship, limit the number of brands that are going to be at first. Limit your territory. Try out your distributor. If they do a good job, dangle that carrot that they can add on to their territory. Not many breweries take that approach, but I think it would be a very good approach to take.
So we only have 3 minutes.
Okay.
Do you guys have questions? Because we're running out of time, so I think it's probably a good opportunity to have some questions.
Yeah, please feel free to pop in some questions.
A lot of good stuff here.
Yeah, I need another half hour.
I know. Time flies when you're having fun.
Stupid real estate. I got hung up in the real estate this time because I've been dealing with so many issues in that. Between ownership agreements and the issues you discussed today, how much time do you think is necessary for us to use a lawyer upon starting? How do we budget that and the startup costs? Oh God, are you one of my clients? So I get asked this all the time, and it's so hard to answer. It's tough to say without knowing the specifics of the business and the scope of the work. I really wish I could give a more definite answer than that, but starting up a business could cost $1,200, or it could cost 15, 20 grand. It all depends on things like, are you going to have passive investors where you have to go through a bunch of securities work? Are you going to have employees that require, employee handbooks, things like that? Is it an operating agreement for a single member LLC, or are there going to be 20 people in it who are negotiating back and forth? These are all just very big variables. It's just, I wish I could give you more information than that, but it's without having a business plan and without having more specifics, it's just really hard to budget. When you budget for startup costs, what I suggest is when you find your lawyer you're going to work with, and I get asked this all the time, and as difficult as it is to answer, I know it's an important question, so I always give it a really good shot to estimate these things. Sometimes I'll even put a capped fee or something like that on it, so you can actually have a real budget in there. But talk to your lawyer about that, and then put the line item in. Because too often I see people just kind of making up a number for what they think their legal costs are going to be, and it's often way off. Just like everything in starting a business, it's always going to be more expensive than you expect. Is that time?
You could go through, if you go a couple more minutes.
Let me just give a brief overview of some of these slides that are left on here, and I apologize for not being able to get into this in more detail.
They don't really need to cover the distribution.
Yeah, you'll get much more of this. Or just buy me a beer. I'll talk about distribution for hours. Insurance, we talked about this already, but get a qualified insurance agent, maybe somebody who has some industry expertise. They'll tell you which of these you need to get. If you live in Oregon, you might need earthquake protection, but if you live in Missouri, maybe not. So it's these are all you might not need all of these, but you'll probably need a lot of them. Bonds are another thing. If you can find an insurance agent who handles bonds, you're going to need a bond for TTB, maybe a state bond as well. If you can find an agent who knows how to do these, it'll really streamline the process. I had a bond rejected by TTB recently because it was somebody who'd never done one before. Find somebody with some expertise. Talked about that in the first session. Finance, we talked about this in the first session, and this we go into excruciating detail on this stuff in 404. Employment is something, I'll just say, once you're hiring employees, hire an attorney and get a payroll service. They'll help you with all this stuff. Employment agreements are becoming more and more important as trade secrets become more important because breweries are wanting to protect their recipes and their confidential information. That's where you protect them. An agreement. Make sure there's a trade secret provision in there, confidentiality provision where they can't be out. Take your recipes, go somewhere else and start using them to make your beer. I've seen it happen multiple times already. My clients get extremely upset when they go to somewhere else and they're tasting their own beer. But if you don't have these provisions in place, there's not much you can do about it. And treat confidential information as confidential. Calling it confidential information is not good enough. Make sure you protect it. Limit who gets access to it. If it's a super sensitive recipe, don't let everybody have access to the whole thing. Give them access to parts of it. I know that seems extreme, but that's how you protect information. And that's it. There's my contact information. Feel free to drop me an email. Give a little plug for the Beverage Industry Networking Group. That's my brewery service providers networking group that we meet on a monthly basis. Any local startups who want to attend there, just get in touch with me about that. We'd be happy to have you.
Oh, Megan's plugging 404.
Oh, excellent.
Starts May 4th.
Oh, does it really?
Yeah, so. You're like, wait a minute, I planned a trip to Cancun.
I'm just thinking about what my Hawaii trip is. Hey, babe, is anybody going out to the Kona Brewers Fest? I'm going out there.
You are?
Yes, I
am. Well, you can work your schedule with Maria.
Yeah, we'll figure that out. That's in March anyway.
Well, thanks, everybody. Great live session. Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure as always.
Sorry that, there's a lot of material here. So
we got through the important stuff.
You're going to have to take 404 to really get in depth.
That's right. This is just one big poster for 404.
Oh, there's Doug saying, loved Kona.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, guys, see you in a couple of weeks.
Bye-bye. Cheers.